Pues bien, vamos a dar comienzo a esta segunda conferencia en el día de hoy, una conferencia que lleva por título Los inicios de la formación en interpretación de conferencias, y la persona que nos va a ofrecer esta presentación es nada más y nada menos que el señor Richard Fleming, que es un grandísimo placer y honor para nosotros poder tenerlo aquí nuevamente. Yo creo que para todos los que nos dedicamos a la interpretación sobran las presentaciones. Richard Fleming ha sido funcionario de las instituciones europeas durante muchísimos años y ha jugado también un papel importantísimo en la formación de intérpretes. Fue durante muchos años responsable del entonces stage, que tal vez recordarán todavía los que ya tienen un poquito más de edad entre el público, y que desde que se ha retirado de su trabajo en activo como intérprete en las instituciones, ha ofrecido varios cursos de formación de formadores en distintas escuelas de forma desinteresada, y en ese sentido cabe destacar que tenemos la grandísima suerte de contar con él ya 4 años, estos últimos 4 años lo hemos podido recibir aquí, y como les digo, es una grandísima suerte y de hecho ya lo consideramos como alguien de la casa. Así que muchas gracias, Richard, te cedemos la palabra.
Thank you very much indeed, Julia. I must say that I'm very honored to be here today. It's one of the first times that I've been able to come up on this side of the table at this type of event. In the past, I was usually in the booth, and I'm not saying I'm going to get my own back now. I don't even know what I'm like to interpret. I hope our interpreters will be able to follow me. In any case, I've given you all a text, much longer than the text I'm going to use, so I hope you'll be able to follow me. Ladies and gentlemen, Director General, I'm honored to be asked to give this talk about the beginnings of training of conference interpreters. Although my initial reaction was, why me? I mean, what do I know about the history of interpreter training? It's true, I was an interpreter for 35 years at the SKIK. I was a trainer too for most of that time, but certainly not a historian, nor even an academic. However, I eventually decided to accept the challenge, mainly because it was the sort of lecture that I'd like to attend myself. I'd like to know more about this. One day I'd like to read a book about the subject. There's no shortage of books on the history of interpreting. There's also a large number of articles and books on various aspects of interpreter training. But I haven't yet come across a comprehensive chronological overview of the way in which the training of conference interpreters has developed over the years. The nearest thing I found to it was Barbara Moser's The Teaching of Simultaneous Interpretation Over the Last 60 Years, which was published in 2005, covering the period 1929 to 1989, and the slightly earlier article from Danica Seleskovic entitled The Teaching of Conference Interpretation in the Course of the Last 50 Years. Now, both excellent papers, but no one yet has done the donkey work of pulling all the strands together. And as I have now a bit of free time since my retirement, I thought I'd have a go. So I've made a start on this, and here's the start now, albeit in a very abridged version, because I only have 45 minutes. First of all, one caveat. As I said, I'm not an academic, so don't expect a mini doctoral presentation with all the references given. I do, nevertheless, intend to produce a longer, written transcript, which I shall send to everyone here or everyone who wants a copy of it. And that will contain the references to the books I've read, the people I've contacted, my contacts in the SCIC and elsewhere, but also a lot of new contacts, people teaching now or in the past at various universities, some of whom are in fact here. So I'd like to thank them now, even if I don't mention them during my oral presentation. So, what have I been asked to talk about? Let's look at the title. Los inicios de la formación en Interpretación de Conferencia. Let's start with the easy part, the beginnings. The first thing I did was to contact Julia and others and say, could I stray a little bit beyond the beginnings? And they immediately agreed because they too were interested in looking at slightly more than the beginnings. So I will be covering quite a wide range, which means I shall have to summarize a fair amount. Then, Interpretación de Conferencia. There are a lot of different definitions of what this is. AIC, I believe, even includes court interpretation if it's done in simultaneous. And I will later be talking about the famous Nuremberg trials as one of the landmarks in simultaneous interpretation, but also an interesting case of ad hoc preparation and training of the interpreters there. However, most histories of conference interpretation tend to date the beginnings of that art to the Paris conference at the end of World War I. And I shall be touching upon that too, since although the trainers had no formal training, they had a sort of preparation which we shall talk about. The formación part now. Well, I should add perhaps that on the question of Interpretación de Conferencia, although the beginnings are traced to the Paris conference, I'm actually going to stray a few hundred years before that, because although there's no formal training of conference interpreters until the 20th century, before that there were requirements for interpreters between, very often, invaders and the invaded, which required interpretation. Now, it may be stretching things a bit to call this conference interpretation, but nevertheless, there were occasions where these interpreters were prepared, groomed, if you like, rather than trained, to be able to work as interpreters. So I will be going back to almost the year dot, but very briefly, to describe how these interpreters were prepared. And you may well be surprised to know that although officially the first interpreting school was set up in 1941 at the University of Geneva, as Carmen told us just now, there were actually schools for interpreters at least 300 years beforehand. So I'll be talking about that in a moment. So where does that leave me in terms of content? Well, as I said, I'll be talking about the early days before the 20th century, then the first consecutive interpreters at the beginning of the 20th century, then ad hoc training at the International Labour Organization in the late 1920s, the training for the Nuremberg trials, and then coming on to interpreting schools and in-house training programs. I may have time to talk about Africa and China in order to avoid being too Eurocentric, but if I don't have time during this presentation, we can discuss it during the course of the next day or two. And I shall say a few words about research and theory, something which I don't know a great deal about, having been more of a, if you like, can-do practitioner, but I've read a lot about research and theory in the last few months, and it has been quite influential in terms of interpreter training. Another key issue is the ever greater professionalization, fortunately, of interpreter training courses, including, of course, training of trainers, which was not something which was done initially. Initially, it was interpreters who started training using their instinct, but eventually they decided it might be a good idea to train some of the trainers. And I should also say something about the way in which organizations such as AIC, CUTI, and the EMCI have steered the whole process. Oh, sorry, jumped too far ahead. So, let's start with the early days, before the 20th century. Human beings, as I think we know, have been around for about 4 million years, but writing has been around for less than 6,000 years. So, while presumably interpreting is much older than translation, there's no record of it until humankind started writing things down. In the 6th dynasty, Egypt, that's the 3rd millennium before Christ, translators and interpreters in the south of the country, in the province of Elephantine, where there were apparently regular contacts with Nubia, came under the supervision of the local governor, who rejoiced in the title of overseer of dragomans, head of missions, keeper of the white bull, and courtier. Now, rather more romantic than Director General, I suppose. You'd agree with that, Marco. It must be one of the earliest references to interpreters, but unfortunately, we don't seem to have found out much about how they were trained. Knowledge of languages and general all-round culture, at least knowledge of the two cultures involved, was presumably enough in the past to be an interpreter. So how did the early interpreters acquire that knowledge? Well, some of them had it already by dint of being ethnic and cultural hybrids. The famous Doña Marina, otherwise known as Malinche, was already familiar with two cultures when Hernán Cortés, found her. She was familiar with the Aztec culture, her roots, but also Mayan culture and language because of her upbringing among the Tabascans. And the third culture and language, Spanish, she picked up quickly through contact with Cortés and his entourage. Sometimes these interpreters or future interpreters were locals who had been brought back home, often forcibly as slaves, to learn the language of the conquerors before being taken back again as interpreters. And sometimes it was the other way around. In this case, this is Champlain, the colonizer of Nouvelle-France and the founder of Quebec City, who decided to install so-called interprètes résidents in the new colony. Basically, young French adventurers were placed with the Indian tribes with whom the French traded. They lived among the natives, dressed like them, hunted and fished with them, and through daily contact with them, these future interpreters became familiar not only with their language, but with their way of thinking. You could call it total immersion. Diplomats, too, needed them, and often for much longer periods than during just conquest or war, which is why both France and the Austrian Habsburg Empire set up schools for the training of interpreters to be used in contacts with the Ottoman Empire to the east. The Ottomans, incidentally, refused to use French or Latin in their dealings with the Western powers, although these were the commonly used diplomatic languages then. The Western powers had learned to their cost that it wasn't always a good idea to use what AIC would call local freelancers, mostly Levantines, Christian traders and adventurers based in the Near East, since they weren't always reliable. Basically, they couldn't keep a secret. Incidentally, the Turks, too, occasionally had problems with their own dragomans, even executing their chief dragoman of Greek origin in 1821. I don't know whether this is the poor Greek who was executed, but apparently he help the Greeks in their war of independence from the Turks, obviously something you shouldn't do as an interpreter. From then on, the Ottoman government appointed only Muslims as translators and interpreters, their own people, since they felt they could at least trust them. As I said just now, it was the French and the Austrians who decided to set up schools to train their own boys. But let's look at one of them, the Oriental Academy, Orientalische Akademie, set up by Empress Maria Theresa of Austria in Vienna in 1754. It later became known as the Diplomatische Akademie in Vienna. Like the French enfants de langue, the original idea was to send these so-called Sprachknaben out to Constantinople to be trained there. And this indeed started in the late 1670s with up to 12 Austrian boys living in the residence of the emperor's representative there to learn Turkish, to learn it with local teachers, and also by going along to the courts and the local markets to listen, to converse, and generally become familiar with the customs, laws, and negotiating tactics of the Turks. So you could say it's a bit like a séjour d'études, but much longer than what we're used to today. And when they were ready, they were duly sworn in as interpreters and employed at official meetings and negotiations, usually staying for between 10 and 16 years. Incidentally, just for the record, one of the last language boys there was a certain Leopold Seleskovich, whose father, Anton Seleskovich, was the incumbent interpreter at the residence. I don't think there's any relationship between them and Danica, but it was an interesting coincidence. In 1753, however, this Language Boys Institute was closed down for various reasons. And the following year, 1754, the Oriental Academy was opened in Vienna to good Christian boys who had to work hard, study the grammar of various languages, and sit 2 public exams every year, so very transparent. The ones with the best marks would spend time later in Turkey, shadowing the local interpreters and learning about Turkish customs and culture. You might be interested in the instructions for learning languages written in 1770, and I quote, this is a rough translation. The teacher should speak the language he's teaching in a natural way. And when doing translations, they should look at the meaning of the text as well as the meaning of the individual words, and start with translations into the mother tongue. And translations should be oral as well as written right from the start. Sounds as if these instructions might have been written by our old friend Anton Seleskovich. Anyway, it goes on to say that every student should produce a speech once a fortnight from a sentence they are given, and every day they should be prepared to tell a story in 5 languages. So they definitely took their language learning seriously. If you look at this is in German, taken from a Diplomarbeit by Alexandra Yukova in Vienna. She did a big study of this school. And just very briefly, you can see what languages they learned. This is the curriculum from 1773. All these boys had to learn Latin, German, Turkish, Persian, Arabic, insofar as Persian and Arabic are necessary to learn Turkish properly, French, Italian, and, for the particularly gifted, modern Greek. So, quite a panoply of languages there. And I think it's fairly clear that these boys' schools in Vienna and Paris were already providing the preparation and training that interpreters needed at that time, way before the first schools, as we know them today, emerged in the middle of the 20th century. But let's move on now to the 20th century. Now, most historians of interpreting say that the conference interpreter as such appeared for the first time at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, when French ceased to be the sole diplomatic language. And this was because some of the leaders of the victorious allies, particularly from Britain and from the United States, didn't speak French, and they wanted to be present, the actual leaders at this conference, and not just leave it to the diplomats this time. The diplomats all spoke French, but the US President and the UK Prime Minister didn't. Now, there were only 12 conference interpreters, 12 consecutive interpreters at the Paris Peace Conference, and only 6 permanent interpreters later at the League of Nations over the next 25 or so years. They hadn't received any specific training, unlike the enfants de langue that we looked at just now, since they'd learned their languages either through their family environment or because they'd studied them at school or during trips abroad, or they'd lived in different countries. Plus, many of them had learned their languages or improved them during the war, helping with liaison between French and English-speaking officers, and even interrogating prisoners. You could perhaps call this preparational training a sort of trench Erasmus. One of the interpreters at the time was that's the conference. One of the interpreters was Jean Hébert, who later wrote the famous manual about interpreting. And reminiscing about one of the first meetings he interpreted in 1917, he said, "I'm grateful that my interpretations were not recorded, because if I heard them now, I should certainly blush." However, that was the best that could be done at the time, and strange as it may sound, it was appreciated. So this self-evaluation suggests that mastering this skill required training, and the only available training then was the on-the-job kind. As for the training of the first League of Nations interpreters, that consisted of doing translation work. They had to do both anyway. They had to do translation when there was no interpretation work. It consisted also of going to meetings and listening to other interpreters. And then, finally, by being eased into the job initially, working in easier or less important committees where, as I said, little damage could be done. Now, all of that is training, I would argue, but not in the sense of attending a training course. That first training course had to wait until the late 1920s, with the first experiments with Simultaneous at the International Labour Organization. As Ingrid Kurtz writes, the next major development was the introduction of simultaneous interpreting, clearly a product of the 20th century. Its invention is attributed to Edward Filene, an American businessman who, with a British engineer and Thomas Watson, the president of IBM, developed the Filene-Finlay IBM system, which was used for the first time at the ILO conference in Geneva in 1927, end quote. Now, why was it tried out at the ILO and not the League of Nations? Well, apart from resistance to simultaneous interpretation at the League from delegates as well as interpreters, they usually used only 2 languages, whereas the ILO at their annual assemblies used up to 7 languages. And the delegates there weren't polyglot diplomats. Obviously, the more languages you use, the more time you save by switching from consecutive to simultaneous. And while no special training had been required for consecutive interpreters, it was clear that training was now necessary for their simultaneous counterparts. The organizers of the experiment took the preparatory process very seriously, in fact. Filene proposed specific training for the interpreters recruited to work as simultaneous, or as they were called, telephonic interpreters. And I quote, "A school of practice for translators, simultaneous, should be organized." Yes. And I've got here what is in the internal ILO report describing how that training for this new art was designed. I quote, "A room in the office building was equipped with the necessary apparatus so that the conditions of the training should approximate as closely as possible to those under which telephonic interpretation would take place at the conference. Training began in February 1928 and proceeded every evening. The interpreters attended in rotation, 2 or 3 at a time. Those who so desired were also able to make their own arrangements for further training during the lunch hour. Initially, speeches actually delivered at previous sessions of the conference were read from the conference record at a moderate and even rate of speed by one person, while another translated into the telephone to a third who listened in for the purpose of checking and criticizing the translation." So, not that different from what's done nowadays. When all the interpreters taking part in the course of training received a certain stage, or reached a certain stage of proficiency, arrangements were made for speeches to be delivered in the style of those made at the conference, so improvised speeches, and on subjects connected with it. Then, during the week before the opening of the 1928 session of the conference, a strict examination was held of the 11 interpreters who showed the greatest proficiency. They tried to get more, but it was difficult in those days. The interpreters undergoing the examination had to interpret instantaneously, as he put it, a speech on a subject relating to the usual conference agenda. The jury decided that 9 of the candidates were capable of acting as telephonic interpreters at the conference, and they were each awarded a sum of $50 as remuneration for the time they had devoted to the training. So perhaps things have changed in the last few years. As a result of all these preparations, in the 1928 ILO conference, real simultaneous interpretation was used throughout the meeting, involving up to 7 different languages. And they continued doing that for the years to come, but usually only at the annual conference. The next major use of simultaneous, and often referred to as its coming of age, were the Nuremberg trials of Nazi war criminals in 1945, something you're probably familiar with. And here, speed was of the essence. In the interest of swift and fair justice, it was important that the trial didn't drag on for years and years. But with consecutive interpretation from and into 4 languages, French, German, English, and Russian, that was a real risk. So simultaneous was proposed as the answer. Goering, one of the accused, of course, who occasionally during the trial commented on the interpretation, as he knew a few languages, once announced wryly to the simultaneous interpreters, "You are shortening my life by several years." In actual fact, he committed suicide, as we know. There were very few interpreters then who could do simultaneous. Just a few ILO staff interpreters, those still around after the war, and they didn't necessarily cover the same languages, the languages needed at the trial. So they had a problem. The chief of interpretation and translation services at Nuremberg was Colonel Léon Dostert, an American of French extraction with remarkable organizational abilities. He recruited interpreters from among students and teachers at the Geneva School, which, as we know, had already been set up, but was teaching only consecutive, and also people who happened to be familiar with several languages. Only 2 interpreters, one of them is Edouard Roditi, who some of us met and worked with, and Hakon Chevalier had any previous simultaneous experience, although there were at least 3 other graduates from the Geneva School, including Marie-France Skunker, think this is a better one of her, who, in fact, later urged her former school to add simultaneous to the curriculum, although it took a few years. These were the only candidates who had any formal training in interpreting, although some others would have had professional experience as interpreters or translators. All the candidates underwent an aptitude test, which involved, in addition to testing their language skills and general cultural knowledge, sitting in a booth and interpreting speeches in a mock trial situation. That was the aptitude test. Of the 400 or so candidates tested, only 5% showed the ability to handle simultaneous interpreting. And according to the organizers, the two main reasons for not getting through this initial test were, one, the inability to control their nerves and emotional stress, and two, the inability to listen and talk at the same time. Now, my comment would be hardly surprising how many of us would have passed such a baptism of fire before we started our training. Anyway, the few successful candidates who were recruited before the trial started then received from 2 weeks to 2 months training in a mock courtroom to enable them to develop speed and fluency and polish their language skills, delivery, and accent. Once the trial started, however, it was all hands to the pumps. All of those who had received training were drafted in to interpret, which meant that the full-scale mock trials had to stop. And anyone brought in later had to do so with even less training. The training usually consisted of being sent first to the translation section for a few months to get used to all the terminology and familiar with the issues. New recruits could also sit in the public gallery or the interpreter's waiting room, again to follow the proceedings and listen to colleagues. All of this helped to prepare them for the real thing, although it was sometimes a bit of a shock for them. Let me quote from an article, Interpretation at the Nuremberg Trial, by Francesca Geiber. She's describing the experience of a Miss Hayward. Miss Hayward recalls going into the visitors' gallery on the day she arrived in Nuremberg and being astonished at simultaneous interpreting, which she had never seen before. The next day, in the booth, she discovered that despite the initial difficulty, she could translate simultaneously. After the trial, Miss Hayward became a freelance interpreter and was hired by the United Nations, where she worked until her retirement in 1981. And she wasn't the only one to go to the UN from Nuremberg. 4 other interpreters there went on to become staff interpreters at the UN, including Chlebnikov, who later became head of the interpretation section there, and a few others besides. Now, that brings us on to the first schools, because a large number of these schools were founded by interpreters from Nuremberg who had just started working, or interpreters who'd been working at the League of Nations before that. As Jesus Baigorri says in one of his excellent books, an ever-increasing number of conferences, organizations, and languages at the end of the Second World War demanded a greater number of interpreters, and thus schools started to emerge. So what were the first university-based schools? Well, we know already that the first one was in Geneva. But why Geneva? Well, because it was then the center of the diplomatic world. It's where the League of Nations was still just about. It was also neutral during the Second World War, which meant that all the spies tended to congregate there to find out what was going on. Apparently they met in the Café Bavaria, which unfortunately no longer exists. It's been turned into an excellent French restaurant. And if you read Ian Fleming's book Goldfinger, you'll see that James Bond went to the Café Bavaria. Anyway, that was why it was set up there by Antoine Velleman, who was one of the 12 interpreters working at the Paris Peace Conference. The next one was Vienna in 1943, and here Eugen Dollmann, who had acted as interpreter between Hitler and Mussolini, taught translation here for a number of years. Then 1946, Mainz or Germersheim, 1947, Graz, 1948, Paris, Hautes Études Commerciales. This was before ESIT. This was set up by French businessmen because they realized there was demand not just for conference interpreters, but interpreters also working in business. Saarbrücken there, also in 1948, and then Georgetown, which is where Léon Dostat returned to after his stint at Nuremberg and also at the UN afterwards. And he went there taking the IBM Simultaneous equipment with him. 1950, Heidelberg, 54, Trieste, where Jean Herbert sat on the admission board. He also sat on the ESIT admission board. So ESIT, the dates are not that clear. 57, 58, ESIT was set up. And Skunke, who we saw a picture of her just now, another Nuremberg veteran, she taught there for several years. And of course, this is where Danica Seleskovich taught and developed her influential theory of traductology, or théorie du sens. It was also where the first doctorate in interpreting studies was introduced in 1975. Then we have more turning up at ESIT, also in Paris. In 1962, Mons, the first one in Belgium. Why Belgium? Well, Belgium was very close to the NATO shape and the emerging EEC. And they started with German, English, and Russian, in fact. Then Pat Longley's PCL, the Polytechnic of Central London. We'll talk about that more in a moment because it's slightly different from the other university courses we're looking here. And last but not least, Monterey in 1969, which was in fact a former military training establishment, and many more later. Now, most of them were initially full translation interpretation courses, like Geneva, which was a 4-year course, with economics, history, law, and translation for 3 years, followed by a year of interpretation. Although I think Georgetown and Monterey were postgraduate right from the start. And today, there's still a mix. We've got a great deal of purely undergraduate programs, often run by the Modern Languages Department of universities, and also some purely postgraduate courses like Comillas, Monterey, and La Laguna. And the latter is the trend that AIC and the EMCI have been encouraging for a number of years. So there's quite a range of courses. And perhaps I could just go through some of them, the various types of courses. First of all, the open general university courses we've been looking at, and then bespoke university courses. By that I mean courses at university but commissioned by an institution. For example, the courses to train Russian and Chinese interpreters for the UN, which were organized in Geneva, but with money from the UN. And then we've got vocational training courses outside university. Pat Longley's course at the PCL is an example of this. She went out of her way to organize it at a technical college because she claimed it was not an academic subject. And she did a lot of things in different ways. She claimed that translation as preparation for an interpreting course might actually be a hindrance rather than a help. And she taught simultaneous at the same time as consecutive. She also encouraged shadowing. So these are some of the issues which are still controversial today in terms of how to teach interpreting. And then in-house training, where I suppose we could talk about the US State Department which under the Marshall Plan organized its own interpreter training courses way back in 1950, and Danica Seleskovic apparently was trained on one of these Marshall Plan courses. But then there's also the UN, the European Parliament, and above all the European Commission, which had its own in-house training courses. I'd love to say something about the UN, to talk about how Leon Dostert moved from Nuremberg to the UN to set up the Simultaneous Interpretation Unit there, and also to talk about how the UN later trained a lot of their people in-house. But I don't have time for that, and you can read about it in Jesus Baigori's book. But it is an interesting area. The UN had in-house courses, but they were never quite as organized, I would say, as the in-house courses at the European Commission. The Parliament had some courses in-house, again, never quite the same as the European Commission. This is a picture of another ad hoc course which was organized in London by Tadej Pili. But again, I don't think I have time to talk about that, but it appears it was the sort of place where young people could go along. It was in a house in central London. They could go along, they could play ping pong, learn to dance, and also learn to interpret if they had the right languages. Okay? If I could, I'd like to say something very briefly about the 30 years of the European Commission's short course. This is, if you like, a plug for the work that was done in the European Commission, training the people we needed, since, although we got large numbers from interpreting schools, we probably for a while got even more from our in-house training course, which was set up by Madame Van Hoof in the 60s. It was originally designed for people with French and German. It was before English joined. It was originally rather ad hoc and improvised, with the trainers, who were other interpreters, popping in to the room where the trainees were from their meetings. They'd come out of their meeting, give a speech, and then go back again. It got much more structured by the time I did it, fortunately, in 73. I did it in 1974. It was already pretty well structured. And as you probably know, it was a 6-month course with an elementary exam every 2 months. And at the end of the 6-month period, the trainees had to do the same recruitment test as people coming from an interpreting school. So it was quite intensive. I wasn't the only one here who did it. Marco also did it, yes, and Natalia. Okay. It's like in an auction. If you do this, you might think you're going to buy. I might sell it to you, so be careful. Okay? A few figures which I compiled myself in 1996, I think it was, and I found at the bottom of a cardboard box in my cellar recently. These are figures for, I say, 30 years until 1996. We had 40,000 applicants. Only 5,000 were tested, so a lot of them didn't have the languages we wanted or hadn't spent time abroad. So we only tested a small proportion of those. And of those, 17% started the course. In actual fact, the pass rate at the Aptitude Test was about 20% because they didn't all start the course. But about 1 in 5 over the years passed the Aptitude Test. So it was quite a tough Aptitude Test. And of those 840 who started the course, you see that more than half of them passed the recruitment test, which meant that at that time in 1996, 206 former trainees were still in the employ of the SCIC. So 46% of the total staff. It was an essential source of interpreters. We couldn't have found the interpreters we need without the stage. Of course, there were, on occasions, friction between schools and the stage because they saw our in-house course as being perhaps unfair competition, but we saw it as an absolute necessity at the time. We also decentralized the stage. It wasn't all in Brussels throughout the period, because in the 70s we thought we might get access to even more potential trainees if we went out to the member states, in fact, countries who were acceding. For example, we trained 43 Spanish trainees by coming out to Madrid, starting the course the first 2 months or the first 4 months, it varied, at the diplomatic school, and then the remaining 4 or 2 months in Brussels. That was in the 70s. And then in the 80s, we went further afield and trained Turks, Vietnamese, students from Hong Kong, and above all, Chinese. Paul Brennan told me that to date, we've trained more than 400 Chinese student interpreters. Okay, so that deals with the stage. Definitely a successful operation, but of course we found that with the plethora of new languages it just wasn't possible to continue, and we had to adopt a different attitude, which was to help the schools out there to train the people we needed, and we did this via pedagogical assistance, but that's another story. I've put photographs of 3 people very much involved in research and theory in the field of conference interpreter training. I shall be brief on this point because I have very little time left. I spent the last few months catching up on research and theory in the field of interpreter training. I shall put more of my findings in my written transcript. But suffice it to say that interpreter training started before people started doing interpreting studies, which meant that initially it was rather instinctive, at worst haphazard, and at best inspirational. But eventually people came to realize that if you do a bit of research into the processes involved in interpreting, perhaps this can help to improve training of interpreters. And the highlights for me include the Paris School's theories of deverbalization, which I suppose weren't totally original, nor were they even empirically proven. It's a subject that interpreters still discuss nowadays, but whether it was proven or not, the idea of getting completely away from the words and just basing everything on meaning and ideas, completely forgetting about the words, it was a great way of weaning students off the word-by-word approach to interpreting. I also appreciated very much the work done by Barbara Moser and others on breaking down the interpreting processes into separate parts, which can then be taught as specific skills. And finally, I would mention Daniel Gilles, whose effort model of interpreting I find particularly useful. And in fact, I often refer to his models, that one and others, in training of trainers courses that I carry out, because I think these really are theories and models of practical use for both trainers and students. Gilles was not very optimistic in 1986 when he wrote, "Teaching methods have not changed for 40 years." But he was a bit more optimistic in 2013 when he said, "Findings of empirical research are starting to become a potentially serious source of input for ideas in training programs. Perhaps things are now looking up." This is just a list of a few influential books on interpreting and conference interpreter training that you're probably familiar with. Jean Herbert's Manuel de l'interprète, left out, Jean-François Rozan's Prise de notes en interprétation consécutive. He later went on to run a hotel in Switzerland. So there's a future for all of us. Then pédagogie raisonnée de l'interprétation, that I think we're all familiar with. It was very influential. It appears that it could have been even more influential if the English version had been brought out quicker. But thanks to Jackie Harmer, we did get an English version. And then Gilles' basic concepts and models. Very briefly, because we haven't talked about methods of training, one could spend hours doing that. Just some of the improvements that have occurred in techniques. Consecutive and simultaneous broken down into separate skills. More recorded material now, so it's easier to practice simultaneous. And then application of good general principles of adult training. What do I mean by that? Well, things like goal setting, feedback, solution finding, progression. These are things which I have to admit we knew very little about in the 1970s. But thanks to training of thanks to training of trainers, and in this case we had a man called Claude Talmont who came in 1992 and who trained more than 100 of our interpreter trainers who were working on the stage, and that definitely improved our techniques. Training of trainers, of course, became a big thing in the 90s. AIC started in Brussels in 1991 with the training of trainers workshops, I believe. So it did become a big thing. And of course, ETI in Geneva even established a trainer's qualification, which some people in the SCIC have now done. And I was looking at the figures for training of trainers. AIC has trained, and this was up to the end of 2013, 300 interpreters. 300 interpreter trainers have been trained by AIC. Now, but SCIC has trained 388. But it means that a lot of us working hard to upgrade the skills of interpreter trainers. Training of trainers, and new subjects have crept in, like voice training and coping with stress, which didn't exist before. I really don't have time now to talk about the influence of associations, but AIC has been very influential. It set up its schools committee, which later became the training committee in 1957, and now has an online schools directory. Universities or schools can only be on this directory if they meet certain basic requirements, which is a good thing. It helps to upgrade universities because they aspire to join this directory. It's also a very good guide for students looking for somewhere to study. The EMCI pilot in 1997, which led to the EMCI consortium number 1 with 17 schools, and now there are 11. And La Laguna, I think, knows all about the EMCI, and you're eager to get back in, as far as I understand. There's at least one school that has decided to withdraw from it in Germany because they felt they couldn't meet the criteria. It always happens when you have a lot of very strict rules because you want to upgrade the overall level. The one-size-fits-all is not always going to be to everyone's liking, particularly in Germany with their university traditions. But it's still, if you like, a force for good, raising quality generally, and then SUTI as well. So, I've now completed my tour d'horizon, although I would like to end by looking at some unresolved issues in the field of interpreter training. Is translation a good preparation for conference interpreting? As I said, Pat Longley was opposed to it, but the Vienna school, Louis Pawlowski, insisted on it. What about consecutive before simultaneous? Most of us accept that, but Pat Longley did the two at the same time. Hong Kong have separate simultaneous interpreters and consecutive interpreters. And Stephen Pearl at the UN, who was I think he was the head of the English booth there, said it was absolutely crazy to think that you needed to do consecutive to be able to do simultaneous. But I think most of us here accept that consecutive needs to come before simultaneous. Then there's the question of which directionality, which way should you work, and very often the Russians had a different idea about this. And is interpreter training, should it be language pair specific, or should we say, well, it doesn't matter what the languages are, it's the same basic approach? Is shadowing a good idea as an introduction to simultaneous? Different views on that. I myself was always opposed to it because I thought it encouraged people to sort of speak parrot fashion, just to repeat what they'd heard. Is it an academic discipline or a practical training? What are the pros and cons of being part of the university? We heard from Mrs. Talley just now. Yes, that's right. Yeah, we heard that there can be difficulties being in the university in terms of the numbers who are passed, and most universities get a certain amount of pressure from the head of faculty. I was talking to people at Leeds recently, and they said, "Why don't you take more people onto this course? Because it's very lucrative." And at the end of the course, why do so many people fail? And why do people like Dick Fleming command such huge expenses? In fact, freelance interpreters, why are they being paid more than visiting professors in other disciplines? So these are things which are not very easy to explain, but of course there are advantages being in a university context in terms of the prestige it gives, and also because being in a university would encourage more research on the whole process. Okay, so to conclude, quoting Jenny McIntosh, interpreter training has come a long way since the Nuremberg trials and those improvised drills they had in a mock courtroom. It has become more structured, the trainers are beginning to receive training for their role, and theoretical insights into the interpreting process now underpin much of what is done in the classroom. Now, I'm sorry I bored you for such a long time. I haven't really gone into the different ways in which interpreting is taught, which is something that I will go on into in my written transcript. But it would be interesting to hear from you in the course of the next day or two whether there are a number of key points which I've left out, which you feel belong in a history of interpreter training, which, as I said, has not yet been written. I'm not necessarily suggesting that I should write it, but I think it would be useful if some sort of joint effort could be organized to put all this together, and therefore it would be useful to find out from you whether there's certain key aspects that have been left out. Okay, so thank you very much. I don't know whether there are any questions. I know we've strayed into the coffee break, but if there are any comments or questions before we have coffee, I'll try and respond to them. Thank you.